Hey everyone, welcome to SPAßBREMSE. This is Ted, and I'm very excited to bring you a great guest that I'm fortunate enough to be recording with in person in Berlin. It's Astrid Zimmermann, who's a managing editor at Jacobin Germany, and we're talking all about the return of GroKo. So, Astrid, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're recording this on the day after a momentous day, which is when Friedrich Merz barely scraped in to become chancellor, having failed on the first vote, which is the first time in the Federal Republic.
Yeah, that's correct.
So he did eventually get in on a second vote, but this was widely seen as a kind of like sort of a humiliation for him. Like he's been trying to project all of this strength and he's this, changes the debt brake before he even gets in, and it was this sort of like, I feel like he's trying to project the kind of like shock and awe style almost, and this is obviously a kind of a roadblock in that, if not so much substantively, but like optics wise, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the big irony of what happened yesterday, because the whole promise, I guess, of this new government was that they were gonna stop with this kind of like infighting and instability of the traffic light coalition. And then there has never been a government that has started more chaotically in Germany than this new GroKo. I think it's interesting that you just also brought up the debt brake, because I would say that for me, these two moments, there's kind of like parallels between these two moments, because I guess they in some ways show the crisis that the centrist parties are in, because yesterday he wasn't able to secure the majority he would have needed for the first vote. And the same thing in some way, I guess you could say, also happened with the debt brake, where he needed to rush it through the old Bundestag, because he knew that the centrist parties alone wouldn't have the 2/3 majority that they would have needed in order to pass that reform. So I think both of these instances show that this sort of like the power base of the centrist parties is crumbling.
Yeah, there was, I think just yesterday you were doing another podcast in German with Lauren Ballhorn, previous guest and editor of Jacobin Germany. Great talk for anyone who understands German. But one of you had a kind of, or maybe it was just in the description, but rather than the GroKo, the Große Koalition, which is, I think most people will know this, but is like a coalition of the two kind of classic post-war Federal Republic kind of people's parties, the center-left SPD and the center-right Union. And under Merkel, there was a lot of these iterations of GroKo. This is, of course, the same coalition that passed the original debt brake back in the day, which we've talked about quite a bit on this podcast. And back, even 10, 15 years ago, when you combine the CDU, CSU, and SPD, like it really was a great coalition. It kind of deserved the name. It had huge majorities, enough to pass, say, constitutional reforms such as the debt brake. Now, I think the tagline that you used was the nicht mehr so großen Koalition. So the not so great anymore, great coalition.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about, I mean, you talked about the background, the kind of like chaos that, you talked a little bit about the background and the kind of chaos that seems to be plaguing the government before it even really gets in there. But what can we expect from this kind of depleted version of the GroKo? Because it's like the critique of Ampel was there was so much infighting, nothing kind of worked. They weren't able to agree on anything. And the way that I think a lot of kind of more like centrist media establishment types are trying to discuss what we have now is like, okay, we're getting back on track. We're going to have a strong CDU leader. They're going to have like a functional coalition because the SPD and the CDU know how to work together. And it's going to be, we're going to finally get things done. I think Bild said, yesterday. I think the headline was like, "Hope is in the government again," or something to that effect, which was funny to read as I'm checking Twitter, and like Metz is not, Metz is losing and being embarrassed. But there's all this kind of like clamoring for like, Germany is back, and we talked about this on a previous episode with Lukas Hemsmeyer, of this kind of this mix of like forward-looking rhetoric, like we're gonna get progress, we're gonna like do the reforms we need. But it's also decidedly backward-looking, both in terms of the actual policies, which we'll get to, and literally just the constellation of the government. So, could you talk a little bit about what you might expect the priorities of this government to be? Because of course they publish these. It's very German. They publish the Koalitionsvertrag, which is I think like 142 pages or something. Like, so I did read through some of that. Of course, though, like. It's not like they sign this agreement and then day one it all goes into law. Things are done kind of stepwise, and there will be opposition and things will fall away. So could you talk a little bit about, I guess, the context leading to this, and then how you think that might shape the actual priorities?
I mean, I think part of this like stability rhetoric might also just be wishful thinking, because the government that we had before, it did kind of like fashion itself as like a reform government, really, that was gonna
exactly more progress, right? Was their tagline,
exactly. So they were gonna break with this kind of like pragmatism of the Merkel years, where you had politics without a vision, basically, but at least you had stability. And then there was this idea that this just led to like the country seemed to just be stagnating, and there was no possibility to move forward into the future. And then you had the Ampel that promised that it was going to do this, but there was no government in Germany that was as unpopular as this government. So I guess the idea that we're now back to having a government without political vision seems like Germany's back. It's doing what it does best, which is pragmatic governance, basically. And I do also think that this is what Merz was trying to do. And I mean, some people prior to him going into office were also discussing whether he would actually be the kind of like neoliberal hardhead that he's set to be. This is sort of his reputation, right? And funnily, this is also what people said about Merkel when she was younger. They thought that she was a kind of like German Margaret Thatcher. And then when she was in power, she was something very different. I mean, like just a conservative pragmatist, I guess. And with Merz, I think the issue is that the conditions that allowed Merkel to do the kind of politics that she did have shifted, and he simply can't do that kind of, he can't perform the same kind of like stability agenda, because she was backed by very like just comfortable parliamentary majorities, and he doesn't have those. And when we look at the priorities of this government, I would say that it's very clear that it has a like sharp class bias, I guess. When you look at, I mean, they're one of the core priorities they have is to get the German economy out of years of recession. But what it's actually trying to do in order to get there is basically just a number of capital-friendly or business-friendly policies. So we're going to see a lot of like tax breaks and tax reliefs for big business. There's going to be deregulation and kind of like easing of like labor regulations and environmental regulations. And then at the same time, the very slim promises that have been made for like middle income households, low income households, they were promised tax reliefs as well. We're only going to get those if the financial possibilities allow. That's what Matt said. And so there's a clear priority already. And then for those that have even less, for the unemployed, we're going to get like sanctions that are so harsh they might as well be unconstitutional. And in doing this, you obviously also kind of sharpen, or how should I say, what they want to do is they want to prioritize what in Germany is called the Vermittlungsvorrang, which basically just means that you can force people into taking up any precarious job, which just solidifies the already very high rates of poverty that we have, because you kind of like lock people into like the low wage sector. So this is obviously like all pro-business. If you're like a business owner, these are good news for you.
Pressing the Hartz-IV button over and over again, being like, there's got to be more juice here.
Exactly.
It's like, I don't know, you've done that already. Yeah.
Exactly. And they're expecting that this will also lead to a boost of investment in Germany. And I'm very skeptical that that's going to happen, because in the last couple of years, Germany has continuously lowered corporate tax, and this has not led to an increase in investment, because no one can you could force businesses, I guess, to invest their profits, but no one's doing this, so they can do whatever they want with these increases in profits. And that's also what they've done in the past. They've either just hoarded all of this money or shelled it out as like dividends to their shareholders. So I don't know, even though this is what the priority is of this new government, to like boost the German economy, I think it's questionable whether they will be able to deliver on this demand. Of course, also the loosening of the debt brake and this like massive investment fund in infrastructure also plays a big role here, and maybe we'll talk about this more later. But I think more or less these are that's sort of the core priority of this government. And then also obviously like crack down on migration. That's their, I guess, like desperate attempt to weaken the AfD. And as we've seen in the last, couple of months, this has only made the AfD stronger and stronger, because no one did a better job at mainstreaming these like very hard right, the hard right policies that the AfD has been calling for in migration and Friedrich Merz.
Yeah, in so many ways, it's like, they're just trying the same ideas over and over, kind of expecting a new result. How many times this idea that like we'll cut some regulation and taxes, and that will then grow the economy, and then we can do more social spending. This is like basically thinly disguised Laffer curve logic of like, we'll cut taxes, the economy will grow more, and then the government will get more revenue because the economy is bigger, even though they're taking a lesser share, which is like, come on, like this isn't even, you can't even play dumb like it's like the 80s or 90s now. It's like, we know this shit doesn't work. Yeah. And so there's this weird mix, because like changing the debt brake like is actually pretty transformative in a lot of ways. And you'd think, well, okay, if you're going to transform, like literally the German constitution, it is a big deal. Well, you would then want to use that to be able to enact other policies that would also be somewhat of a sea change, you'd think. But it's like they want this increased room for maneuver, but seem to just want to use that room for maneuver to do more of the same, I guess, with the exception of some defense and infrastructure. It's day one, and like they already seem out of ideas. Yeah. And I think that's, I think there's a few different things going on with the rise of the AfD, and we can talk a little bit about that, especially in the conclusion. One of them is, like you said, the kind of mainstreaming of this anti-immigration discourse. But I think the other is like just sort of disillusionment and the feeling like we know what the other parties have on offer. So like, well, fuck it, let's try something new. And by like the same two parties that everybody's used to being in government all the time, trying basically just rehash versions of what has been going on in Germany for, I guess, over 2 decades now, with Hartz-IV 03. So like, it's like, you can't keep trying to get more out of the same policy over and over. And this is, we've talked about Hartz-IV like so much on this podcast before, and you mentioned like the sanctions. Like there was some loosening of those with Bürgergeld, right? is they're effectively trying to go back to like the previous like very harsh system where, like you said, rather than trying to help people stay in their field where they might be more productive because it's actually what they're trained to do, it's like, no, like, fuck you, take like the shittiest job ever or you're not getting unemployment. This, I mean, a simplified version of what the dynamic is here, right?
Right. And I think, I mean, you're right in saying that part of what this government is trying to do is basically like going back to the 80s and the 90s. But then, as you said, they combine it with this loosening of the debt brake. And I think the fact that these two things are happening at the same time tells you a lot about the kind of class project that this government is going to be. Because I think in part they're doing this because they've lost so much power. So as a centrist political force, you're gonna, ever desperately cling to power. And this is sort of their last try to provide some form of political stability, knowing very well that the debt brake has basically kind of limited all of their political possibilities. But of course, what they don't want is to loosen the debt brake in a way that then makes room for social investments. And so I think this is actually the sort of kind of cruel genius of this deal that Merz pushed through the government, because it essentially means that the core function of the Schuldenbremse is the depoliticization of the question of the allocation of resources, which is a deeply political question, one of the most important political questions that any government that comes into power has to answer. Because prior to this, any kind of social investment that wouldn't directly benefit capital, so like investments in education, social housing, decarbonization of the German industry, etc., could be blocked simply by saying, even if we wanted to do this, our hands are tied. So this is just like, you present it not as sort of, this is class warfare from above, but this is a question, this is a politically neutral decision. This is just, there's no technical possibility. We have no room to go. And now they're arguing in the same vein, but they're simply saying, because we spend so much on the rearmament of Germany, we have our defense spending is so high, we're forced to cut elsewhere. And where are we going to cut? It's going to be harsh social cuts. And I think this is really important to understand. So you end austerity, but only partially. You end austerity for the arms industry and a little bit also, I guess, for the construction industry that will benefit from this infrastructure fund. And in the same breath, you can argue for harsher austerity for the broad majority. And I think the fact that this is coupled together speaks to what this government is trying to accomplish.
Yeah, it's like, I guess in the 2010s, the German government could say, our hands are tied on both the domestic and international level. Like you said, you go to, groups demanding more social welfare, et cetera, say, sorry, our hands are tied. But there at least was some degree of consistency, because they'd also go to, the NATO meeting and say, oh, sorry, we're at 1.2. Like, we can maybe give you 1.4 in 5 years. And now it's like they still want to come with that hands tied logic to any kind of domestic constituency.
Exactly, yeah.
But this time they do want to be able to go to the NATO summit and say, like, we'll give you 2.5.
Exactly.
And that seems to be the difference, really.
Yeah, correct. I mean, I'd agree.
And I wonder, like, I mean, in some ways it seems like Germany it's becoming kind of more normal in a way. Like, I mean, during the 2010s, we always heard so much about it being like an island of stability, especially with like the figure of Merkel, how it, due to its special history, it defied the rise of, the far right, and there was this kind of deeply ingrained political culture, et cetera, et cetera. And, seemingly not having this anti-incumbent sentiment that has become like really widespread around the world. Merkel, I bet if she ran again in 21, she would have done quite well. I mean, she really had like remarkable approval figures. But now it seems like Germany's kind of just reached a state that's pretty similar to what you see elsewhere, where it's like, I don't know, say in the UK, right? Like everyone's sick of the Tories. Labour wins in a landslide, but within a couple months, everyone hates Labour, and now the far right Reform Party there is polling incredibly well. And it's like, you know, the CDU. People tried to make it into more of a landslide than it was, I guess, this year. But it was a clear
terrible outcome for them.
You know, it was a relatively kind of clear outcome, but already before, already before Merz took office, like his popularity declined really substantially. So, like, what's your take on that kind of move in public opinion, or exactly why he was so unpopular so quickly? I mean, is there like the Austerians would tell you that like Germans just really do love the debt break, I guess, and that he's unpopular because of that. But people are also mad at like crumbling infrastructure. So like, what's your sort of take, I guess, specifically on like why the incoming government seems unpopular already? And if that speaks to this kind of just broader disillusionment with established parties, norms, etc.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's true that he lost popularity, but the truth is also that he was never that popular to begin with. So I think I would also say that there's this, you know, people are I think there's always the danger to focus too much on people's like disillusionment with certain political personnel. That also happened after the Ampel. People were saying, oh, they just hate Scholz, they hate Habeck, which is true. They hate them, but they also just hated this government and what this government did. And I think the same can be said about someone like Merz. It's not so much the fact that, you know, he's just an unlikable like former financial lobbyist that just,
by all accounts, he is kind of a grating personality, which I think affected
yes.
Like I think it was just a lot of MPs being like, fuck you, man. Like we just like they just were annoyed at him. Like that was a lot to do with yesterday, which is like, but there's a difference between kind of grating with your political colleagues and being unlikable with the public, I guess.
Yeah. But I think that there's sort of like a larger disillusionment with politics on a much, much deeper sense. And I think the fact that none of these centrist parties were able to deliver a convincing answer to the very like deep economic and political challenges that we've faced in the past years. We've gone from crisis into crisis into crisis. That has a lot more to do, I think, with this like deep-seated Unzufriedenheit, how would you say that? Just
dissatisfaction.
Exactly. With this new government, people are very skeptical that this government is gonna lead Germany out of the recession in the same way they were very skeptical that the Ampel would deliver on any of its promises. And this is obviously the one party that has massively profited from this is the right. And I think the problem is also that the economic recession, the fact that real wages are not just stagnating, but that they have also they've been falling, that there's this crisis in the industry, that's connected. Because if again and again and again you have governments that come into power and that promise the population, we've known, you know, the past years have been hard, there's been you know, inflation, etc. But we're finally gonna deliver and on our promises, and then nothing actually happens, and you know, inequality is still rising, the economy is not growing, the conflicts of the allocation of resources just getting harsher and harsher. The answer of the political right becomes all the more convincing, because what they say is we're not going to redistribute resources from the rich to the poor. We're just going to redistribute by quote unquote remigrating. And this is a convincing narrative. So I think these two things they're just connected.
I mean, what I find remarkable about like political discourse in Germany is like sometimes it won't even really be a matter of saying like we're going to make your life better and then not delivering. Sometimes they'll just say die fette Jahre sind vorbei, the fat years are over, which and like it's a, you know, I know like people don't have the same sort of acquisitive instincts as they do maybe in the US, and thinking that we can have endless expansion forever. But I don't think most people want to hear like toughen up, tighten your belt. Like people then like rightly will see this and be like, wait, what fat years?
Exactly.
What golden age? Because well, yeah, like maybe the rich people at the top of the CDU are like, well, I was sitting really pretty in the 2010s. It's of course not them that they're expecting to tighten their belts under this, but they're telling everyone else like, you've had it really great. Now it's going to get worse. But the reason everyone's mad at them in the first place is they don't feel like they're doing that great. So it's like,
Yeah.
what are we even doing here?